to the channel, guys. This is Eddie from Eddie's Customs and Restorations, and I'm bringing you a video today about primers, specifically self-etching primers, primer surfacers, epoxy primers, and DTM primers. Okay, and I'm going to explain pretty much the differences and when you want to use those or when you do not want to use those, depending on whatever you're working on. So diving right in, what you see here on these differentials is epoxy primer. The reason I chose epoxy primer was because I want to waterproof this as best as I can. And also, you can top coat this without having to resand or anything like that. You have a window, depending on who makes the product that you're using, generally they're gonna fall in the days of about 5 to 7 days that you can recoat without having to do anything but clean. So I have a couple of rattle cans, which we'll get to those in a second, but we're gonna talk about the sprayable epoxy primer first. So if you're in the restorations industry, you're generally going to use more epoxy primer than anything else when it comes to bare metal. And the reason for that is because epoxy primer is very forgiving. And what I mean by forgiving is that self-etching primer is acid-based. There's acids within the self-etching primer. And the problem with those acids is, yes, it does treat the bare metal and pretty much prevents rust and all that. However, the reason it is not so friendly for other top coats is that acid-based compound that it has in there, it will create like fraying around your paintwork. And what I mean by that is kind of like you'll get like, for example, say that right here you did some body work and you put and you have some original paint around here. Well, that original paint might tend to want to lift, and you're gonna start seeing like bubbling around the edges because that acid is lifting up on that other top coat. So you cannot paint directly over self-etch primer. You have to apply a primer surfacer or a high build primer. And with epoxy primer, you can use it as a sealer, and you can start spraying paint directly on top of that if you want to. So you see, in a sense, epoxy primer is a little more expensive, just slightly, just ever so slightly. It's not such a huge difference, but you're only dealing with one material. When it comes to self-etching primer, you have to not only buy your self-etch, you also have to buy your primer surfacer. And once you're done spraying a thin coat of self-etching primer on your panels or your parts, you have to immediately pretty much apply a primer, a high build primer, a primer surfacer directly on top of that. And with epoxy primer, you don't have to do any of that. You just spray the epoxy primer and forget about it for the day. You know, if it's if you're done for the day and you're like, damn, if I walk away from this in the morning, it's already all gonna be flash rusted. Well, with epoxy primer, you don't have to worry about that. Epoxy primer is waterproof, so you could forget about your panel. If you have a car that you're working on and you are going to park that car, it's a project car, and you know it's going to take you a couple of years to get to it or to finish it or do work to it or whatever may be the case, you can leave it in epoxy primer and forget all about it, and it's not going to rust on you. Of course, epoxy primer does not have UV protection properties, so it will fade. However, if you do experience fading, all you got to do is sand it with 180 and reapply a little bit of another coat of epoxy primer over that. So that's another forgiving factor that epoxy primer has. So another thing is you could do body work directly over epoxy primer as opposed to the self-etch. You would have to self-etch the panel and then do your high build primer and then do your body work on top of that. Okay, so you're pretty much asking yourself now probably, what's the purpose of using self-etching primer then? Well, it still comes in handy when it comes to speed, okay? Because epoxy primer has what they call an induction time, so you have to mix up your epoxy primer, let it sit for about 15-20 minutes in the cup that you mixed it in, because it kind of has to, like they say in the technical data sheets, they got to kind of get to know each other basically before you can apply it to whatever it is that you're working on. So if you run a collision shop that you're popping out cars, 5-6 cars a day, you don't got time to be wasting and waiting on epoxy primer to finish its induction time and all that stuff. You don't have that kind of time. So that's where stuff like this comes in handy, because this self-etch primer, it cures very quickly, and you can scuff it up and apply a primer surfacer on top of this, and pretty much you're good to go. So if you're doing body work and you're down to the bare metal, you can spray a little bit of this self-etching primer. You can find this at your auto parts or even hardware stores like Home Depot, Lowe's, things like that. You can find those there, and it's perfectly fine. I've used it before on a couple of projects. Like my Chevelle, for example, has some of this in the trunk, underneath the paint. And it's been 3 years since then. For that one's a perfect example. I see that car every day, so you won't have any issues with that primer. It will protect your bare metal. Okay, so the reason you don't want to go with just a urethane or a polyester, for example, a polyester feather fill primer would be because that primer is very porous, and it will absorb moisture. And even though it's been a day and you put it out in the sun, whatever the case may be, and you think it dried it out, well, moisture can still stay trapped in there, and it'll creep into your panel, and now you're going to end up with trapped moisture whenever you do your top coat, and when you finish it up, and you end up with a flawless paint job, but there's going to be moisture trapped in there, which later on in time is going to cause rust. So another thing you can do, for say if you're doing some body work on a panel and you don't have self-etching primer, okay, and you got bare metal and all you got is your urethane primer, well, what you could do after pretty much priming that, it's okay to primer on top of that bare metal, but what you'll have to do after that is apply a sealer before you apply your paint. So sealers, they have several different purposes, and their most popular purpose is that they hide imperfections. So for example, let's just say you have a car and the car used to be black and you're changing the color to a red, for say, and 90% of the car is in primer, but you have a couple of spots where you can still see some black creeping through. Well, the popularity that sealer gets is you can make the car more uniform if you throw a coat of sealer, because it brings it all to a uniform color, and you don't have to be there giving it multiple passes in that area of base coat to cover. Base coat is a lot more expensive than sealer is. So people will generally tell you, hey, use some sealer and get the consistency a little more even. Your panel, get it a little more even with a consistent color. That way you don't have to do multiple passes, right? Well, a sealer is pretty much, epoxy is in a sense a sealer as well, because it's sealing the panel and it's not allowing moisture. So regular sealer that is used for before a paint job, you don't sand that, okay? I mean, some sealers you do, but the majority of sealers, you apply them thin right before a paint job, and they're so thin and they lay out so nicely that you don't have to sand that. You immediately paint on top of that, and you do have a window, so you can't just seal the car and walk away from it and paint it tomorrow. You can't do that. Once you apply the sealer, you need to paint, you need to lay down your base coat after that. As I mentioned, that sealer is going to keep moisture out. So if you did skip the, if you did a fender bender repair and you didn't do an epoxy primer or you didn't do the self-etch, you can still do a sealer and it'll still help you. It'll still provide that corrosion resistance that epoxy primer or self-etch would have done for you. Now, DTM primers. DTM primers are basically self-etch primer mixed with a primer surfacer already, or a high build primer. You're getting both of them in one. Pretty much that's what it is. It is a cheaper option. However, if you start to think about the actual science of everything, you're mixing both, so you're gonna kind of give a little bit. I've actually seen it already. There was a vehicle that I had in the shop that I had applied some DTM primer on, and in case you guys may ask, it was an Evercoat DTM primer. Very good primer, but there was an incident where the vehicle was pushed outside, and it just so happened that day it rained, and I wasn't around to put the vehicle back in, so it got exposed to water, pretty heavy water. So I did find traces of rust starting to come back from underneath, and I know that panel was extremely clean before I applied the DTM primer. So what I'm trying to say is that DTM primer, even though it's labeled that it does have self-etch and everything, it still remained porous, and it still allowed moisture to creep in under it. You know what I'm saying? So moving on to this, for example, this is an epoxy primer, right? And I sprayed this last night, and this is the nice thing about epoxy primer. You can spray it, and if you're done for the day, you're done for the day. You go home, And now all I got to do is wipe it down, make sure it's good and clean, and now I can apply my my undercoating that I'm going to apply to this. You see, most undercoatings they require a primer, right? So any kind of undercoating that you apply, any paints, they're all going to require a primer. It doesn't matter what they say. I mean, I've seen it already. This krylon stuff, it works really nice. It mimics the satin black finish anyways. This satin black, it mimics the original satin finish on hot rods. So if you have, suspension pieces, things like that, I strongly recommend putting them in epoxy primer first, just to add that extra layer of protection, because that is waterproof. And then go on and apply some of this Fusion Krylon all-in-one. See, and the reason I love this stuff, but at the same time, I have some bad things to say about it, because, they say, oh, it's got maximum rust adhesion, things like that. It is good, but if you use it on its own, if you sandblast a piece and you end up spraying this directly on top of the bare metal, rust free, it doesn't matter if you leave it outside and the sun gets to it and the moisture and the weather and everything. I live in a very humid area, and it definitely does start to have some rust creeping up after a while. So if you live in a high salty area, where it snows and they put all the salt on the roads and all that, I would not trust this on its own as a standalone product. I would not, but it does leave a very beautiful finish as compared to a lot of the other spray can type paints. Okay, so pretty much it'd be safe to say that use the epoxy primer as your base, as the protection that you're gonna trust. And as I was saying a little bit earlier, that you don't have to come back and sand this like you would with self-etch, because self-etch, you have to do the self-etching primer, and then you gotta apply a primer surfacer on top of that. And then you would have to sand that primer surfacer, take more time out of your day, and more time that the customer is going to have to pay for, and just to do a top coating. You know what I'm saying? So with this epoxy primer, it's a one and done, and you have a couple of days to put a top coat on there. So you can choose this by all means. It works great. It leaves a very nice finish. The other nice thing about epoxy primer is it not only promotes adhesion to whatever top coats you apply on top of it, but it also bites really well into your bare metal. And there's actually another video on my channel where I talked about VHT epoxy paint. So this is one of those. This is one of the exclusions actually that I have to what I said earlier about, you know, rattle cans not really having very trustworthy labels where they say that, you know, the rust isn't going to come back or things like that. See, but there's a reason why this one does not face those kind of issues. And the reason is right there. It's epoxy, you know, it's epoxy paint. So basically you got epoxy primer mixed in with black paint, so you're getting that waterproof type protection, and it works very good. Now a lot of people will say that they might not get a very nice finish when you're spraying this out, and that's true. It doesn't always have a very slick, nice finish. If you have a little bit of lint left over, anything like that, when you're doing your cleaning, it's gonna show. Trust me, it's gonna show. So what some guys, there was a person on the channel there that had pretty much commented on there, and they said that it looked like crap when they sprayed it. So to him, I mean, it might have come out looking like crap, I guess, but I'll tell you one thing, it's gonna protect the piece, and the piece is gonna stay looking very good without rust and stuff like that, or at least decent enough, because he said it looked like crap. So, like complete garbage, I think was what he said. So another thing you could do is you can apply this, and if you don't like the finish, you can you know, after you do your flash times, because you got about a 10-minute flash time, or 5 to 10 minute flash time. And what I mean by flash time is you got to let it sit after you apply your coat. You let it sit, let it dry, because those vapors, they need to escape. And then after that, after doing, you know, 2 coats of that epoxy paint in a can, you could do that, and then right after that, apply this as your final coat on top of it. And I would say you're gonna be definitely happy. Another thing, if you apply this guy right here and you're not happy with how smooth the surface is, or the surface is not smooth at all, what you could go back and do is you could just sand that down and make it smooth again. You know, get some 400 grit or 600, because you don't want to burn through. It'll defeat the purpose if you burn through. You can go ahead and sand that down with like 600 grit and smooth it out to get to the smoothness, you know, achieve that you want to achieve, and then put some of this on top of that, and now you'll know that you'll be covered when it comes to corrosion resistance. And just so you have an idea of what the satin black fusion all-in-one looks like, I ended up spraying this directly over the differentials because the customer decided not to go with powder coating on this, to kind of save on cost. That way we don't have to tear into these differentials too deeply. But yeah, this is the finish that it gives you. And of course, with the epoxy primer applied underneath this, you have, you know, the protection. So anyway, this video is long enough. I hope I answered all the questions that you may have. A lot of you are going to say that this was very long, but I think I touched base on a lot of the questions that most people have a lot of doubts in out there, and when they're trying to get into this industry. If you got any questions, let me know down below in the comment section. I try my best to get to all the comments, and I try to respond to everyone in a timely manner. It might take me a couple hours, a day or two, but I try to get back to everybody. So God bless you guys. Be safe. And until next time.